Okay everyone, welcome back to another Quarantine Dominions 5 Nation Guide, which means we are here once again on the potato computer with the potato microphone. I promise I will replace them as soon as possible, but for now, I appreciate all of you who are sticking with me. And we're going to use today to fill out the Oceania series by doing the only other incarnation of the nation, Middle Age Oceania. There is only Middle Age Oceania because unlike Pangaea, there is every sign that after the Middle Age, Oceania ceases to exist in the Dominion's lore, and we'll go through that in the lore section. What I'm going to do with the guide today is we're actually going to focus more on a few deep dives on a couple of the units and mages that Oceania has available to them, because you would struggle to find a nation in Dominions that is closer or more similar to its early age compatriot than Middle Age Oceania is to early age. It is basically the same nation. It loses very little. It gains a few new tricks. Unfortunately, it gains those tricks in an environment where its competition is much stiffer and harsher. Nonetheless, what I'm going to do is, again, we'll talk through the lore, what happened to Oceania in the early age leading into the Middle Age, what's going on. We'll go through the few changes that exist to its roster and what those mean. We're going to do a few deep dives. We're going to talk about the Sirens a little more. We're going to talk about thugging a little bit more, raiding, and most importantly, we're going to talk about the implications of the new cavalry that Oceania gets. And then we'll do a little bit of a roundup at the end. But I imagine this one might be on the shorter side because so little changes from the early age video. If you haven't already seen the early age Oceania video, strongly recommend you go check that out first, because a lot of the units that are in this roster, I'm just going to be skipping because I assume you've listened to that guide and you've done the coverage that we had there. So, lore, first and foremost. So, Oceania in the early age wasn't having a great time. What basically was happening was Atlantis, as you know, early age Atlantis was arising from the basalt city. They were organizing, and they were basically driving back Oceania. They were consuming a lot of the fish, because of course deep ones reproduce quickly, they're ravenous, they're adapted to their environment, so they were driving back these sort of nature-held areas of the ocean. They were polluting the kelp forests, it's suggested. Now, whether that was magical or just biological byproducts, who knows. The point was, the creatures of Oceania, the Capricorns and the wildlife, were being pushed back. And then Relay dropped a star on the basalt city and basically annihilated it. And this stops the Atlantean onslaught on Oceania. Suddenly, there are the star spawn in the city of Relay. Atlantis has lost a lot of its leadership. And suddenly there are threats coming from other angles that cause the amount of effort that Atlantis can focus on Oceania to basically die off. Which means that there's this opening for Oceania, maybe. Now, in the ordinary Dominions lore, if there is no Ascension War, if time just keeps tracking on towards the late era, then what happens is the star spawn of Relay eventually, by opening the Void Gate and unleashing madness on the ocean, do push Atlantis mostly out of the waves, with a few exceptions. They push Erythea, so they destroy the old Pelagian Empire and push them ashore, and nothing again is heard of Oceania. Which makes me think that it, just like the entire ocean, is basically destroyed by the dreams of Relay. That's a pretty dark thought, because if the Dominion's planet, the canon map setting, is roughly Earth-like, and if you map out where nations are and which nations we know they're next to, it looks kind of Earth-like, and they certainly fit on an Earth map. That is a lot of territory to basically be rendered insane and lifeless by the Void Gate and the dreams of Relay. Certainly more of a disaster in terms of geographical territory, perhaps, than the destruction that's caused by the Ashen Empire when Urmor goes pants on head retarded going into the Middle Age. But if you play Oceania in the Middle Age, then things are actually changing. With the emergence of the new god, the Capricorns get their shit together, they rally the nation, they bring together these disparate groups of the Centaurs and the Satyrs and the Minotaurs and whatnot, and they actually decide to resist. They lead the nation in a conquest of a sea that was once theirs, that was once held by the wilds. And maybe, if the player intervenes, there is a chance for them to push back Atlantis, for them to push back Relay, for them to save the oceans that they once called their own. I guess it comes down to how good you are as a player. Let's talk about what tools that have changed so far as the Oceania lineup goes, because realistically, this is one of the least changed nations out there. In terms of the actual changes to your special abilities, the only difference is instead of getting +2 turmoil in coastal provinces, you're now only +1 turmoil in coastal provinces. This is a straight buff because you'd rather have the extra rec points and gold rather than the recruitment discount on your Capricorns and Sirens anyway. So it's a straight buff. Then in terms of the roster, very simple thing. They now have access to bronze. That's about it. You see some bronze armored troops out there that give you a little bit more weight in your roster. Otherwise, it's pretty much the same. So, the Ichthys Satyrs over here, completely the same as before. The Ichthys Satyr soldier now has a bronze cuirass instead of a turtle shell cuirass. This is arguably a downgrade because the extra protection trades for a lot more encumbrance. The turtle shell version is, however, still available. This is the namesake unit of Oceania. Oceania Middle Age is called EA Oceania Myrmidons. Myrmidons are heavily bronze armored hoplite satyrs. That said, I don't recruit these guys much, unfortunately. Let's have a look at it. So it's 15 gold, 28 resources, 26 recruitment points for a 14 hit point, relatively strong, pretty slow moving, very high encumbrance, 18 protection, formation fighting amphibian that does 17 damage. This means if you want to as Oceania, you can have quite a closely packed infantry front line that hits moderately hard. They're more expensive in gold terms than, say, Ormish infantry, but they hit pretty hard. They formation fight, they've got good stats. Magic resistance 13, morale 11 are both good, and of course they're amphibious. The problem is, for the Myrmidons, Oceania's cavalry constantly outshines its infantry, and for that reason, the Myrmidon is not a common pick for me. They have their place, sure, but that place is not normally in my roster. Then there's a bunch of familiar units that you'll recognize before. So the Ichthys Centaur is still the same awesome unit it was before. It's still stupidly cheap in resources and rec points for what it is, which is a high stat light cavalry unit that is amphibious. The Aphroy have not changed at all, which is a downgrade when you think about it, because you're going into the Middle Age where things are generally tougher. The coastal satyrs are the same. There is now a bronze armored version of the Minotaur, the Ichthys warrior. All my analysis stays the same, except this guy has bronze armor. Also, they're a little more chill than they were before. The Minotaurs are now Berserker 2 rather than Berserker 3. In general, I would suggest that the bronze armored version is much better because it will survive longer. It is worth the upgrade. There is also, like, the aesthetic point to realize, which I think it just generally looks better. The key addition to the troop roster is this thing, Ichthys Centaur Cataphracts. Ichthys Centaur Cataphracts are the reason that Middle Age Oceania is probably a production nation. The Ichthys Centaur Cataphract costs 35 gold, 27 resources, and 22 rec points for an 18 protection, 22 hit point unit with a short bronze trident, which is a length 3, so repel capable weapon that does 18 piercing standard. This is a very good unit. It's got 13 magic resistance, it's got 14 morale, it's got good stats across the board, and again, there's 22 hit points there. Let's do a little bit of a comparison here, because I just sketched out some statistics before I went in. There are lots of cavalry out there that people respect in the Middle Age. I just got a sample of them. I looked at Black Knights of Ulm, I looked at Knights of Avalon from Man, which are a cap only, and I've looked at the Royal Guards of Myrmidons. Now, across the board, the Cataphract is the cheapest in gold terms by far from all of them. They range from Royal Guards costing 40 to Knights of Avalon costing 60. Plus, you can get the Ichthys Centaur Cataphract everywhere. The resource cost is less than half of all of the other ones. So for all those other heavy cavalry units, They range from 56 resources for the Knight of Avalon up to 68 for the Black Knight. HP, it's not even close. 22 for the Centaur Cataphract compared to 12 for the Marignon unit, 14 for the Man unit, and 15 for the Black Knight. And those hit points matter, right? Especially when people start throwing armor negating or armor piercing damage, it's your hit points that keeps you alive. Lo and behold, this thing has the hit points to spare. In terms of stats, it's equivalent. They all have either attack value 11 or 12, so it's in the same sort of ballpark. Defense-wise, it's got more defense than the Ormish one, less defense than the Knight of Avalon or the Royal Guard. The protection is an area of weakness. It's got the same protection as the Knight of Avalon, obviously less than the Black Knight, 23 versus 18, less than the Royal Guard, 21 to 18. So, but 18 protection is still a lot of protection. You know it's not Ormish black plate, but it's still pretty damn good. The magic resistance is another area of serious advantage. The Ormish Black Knight has an MR of 9, which opens it up to all sorts of save or die spells. The Knight of Avalon rides a unicorn, so they're tied on 13, and the Royal Guard has an ordinary human one of 10. So, high magic resistance. It also performs pretty well on morale. And in terms of attack, most of these cavalry units, with the exception of the Knight of Avalon, have their initial lance attack, which admittedly this Cataphract doesn't have, and then they have a sword or a Morning Star, so a basic one-handed weapon. The short bronze trident is better than those weapons, and then they have a hoof attack, which this doesn't have. So you trade out the hoof attack for a better basic attack. They don't have a lance. Now, the Knight of Avalon adds an alicorn, the unicorn like spike magic damage attack, but again, the Knight of Avalon's a bit of a hard comparison because it's a cap only that costs 60 gold. This thing is a bargain for the amount of hit points, killing, protection, survivability, mobility, versatility, you name it, it is here. Now, let's be clear, it's not like a Vanhir or a unit that completely shapes the meta of an entire era if they're facing a nation, but this is a unit that is good enough to build expansion and to build a nation on, and it's good enough that you want production in your roster because you can now really efficiently use all the bloody gold that you're going to have as Oceania. So, the Centaur Cataphract is a small addition to the roster, but it's a very important addition to the roster. And in my view, you will still be using them alongside their ordinary colleagues. When you're tight on resources, you'll be doing these. You'll use your excess resources to produce these. Lo and behold, you'll produce mixed cavalry forces. The Cataphract is also good enough that you may not be using Aphroid to expand. You may not be investing in enough of a bless for the Aphroid to be worth the extra gold involved in getting them out there. Just a thought. In my expansion, I used a mixture, but I realized I probably could have gotten by using no sacreds at all, or maybe only bringing the sacreds out if I needed a poison-resistant band of units to hang with a Foul Vapors caster. In terms of your mages, nothing changes except now the Cataphract, the Centaur commander now wears equipment, bronze armor, and therefore costs more resources. Still got a Pearl Trident, magic damage, all good. But other than that, this lineup is pretty much the same as it's always been. Which makes this really simple to do as a video. The key difference is that you have the Cataphract. Now, the indies are obviously harder as well in this area, so the question is, can you still expand like an absolute maniac? Yes, you can still expand like an absolute maniac. That was like 35 provinces or whatever on a pure scales expansion build. Fantastic. And before you get excited and ask, am I now going to go to the mod inspector to talk about the other changes to this nation? You know, heroes and spells. There aren't any. The heroes are exactly the same, so the analysis holds. The unique spell is exactly the same, so the analysis holds. Except for the fact that growing your forts gets worse in every era because everyone else's forts are getting better because the humans are learning how to move from stuff like sticking planks together to building like Crac de Chevalier out of like these 3 CP citadels out of stone. This middle era is when you start seeing 3 CP capitals from certain nations or 3 CP forts from some of the more industrious humans. Oceania will still lag behind. You also, as it's middle era, lose one of your nature gem income points from your capital, which hurts a little bit. That's the roster. That's all the changes. Now, I'm going to give a brief talk about what this means strategically and how Oceania should use its new strength and adapt, and what it means for where it places in the era. And then we're going to talk about some specific tactics. So otherwise, this video would be like 5 minutes long, because it's basically EA Oceania, but they learnt how to like make some bronze on land and bring it underwater and be useful with it. So let's talk about why, despite its upgrades, so first of all, what changes about the way you run EA Oceania? So EA Oceania goes from being not needing production because your primary unit, the Centaur, just the Centaur, basic, going from being mostly gold and rec point limited to being resource limited now that you put them in armor. So I think that flips Oceania into a production nation. Other than that, the Mage lineup is the same thing as always. We're mostly just flipping to a resource intensive build, which gives you a little more gold as well, and gives you a heavier front line, which means you're more able to take straight up fights. That's the main difference. That means that Middle Age Oceania is a strictly stronger nation than EA Oceania. However, it runs into the problem of living in the Middle Age rather than the Early Age, and this is a serious problem for it. And it's why I'd actually consider MA Oceania to be a higher difficulty option than EA Oceania. Why? Well, it's about who you're hanging with. And we all know the land nations of the Middle Age include some of the scariest out there. Celeria is kill on sight. Nazca is still kill on sight despite its nerfs. There are some dangerous nations out there. But underwater, you face stiffer competition than you did in the early era. Middle Age Relay is the best relay. There's no way around it. Switching out the Aboleths for the Illithids is a really good move in general and gives them access to a more flexible roster that is capable of going on land and has all sorts of other advantages. The addition of the Meteorite Guardsman gives Relay goes from having trash infantry to some of the best infantry in the game. I would argue the Meteorite Guardsman is probably better than some Ormish infantry. Why? Much higher magic resistance, half upkeep, built-in magic weapon, higher hit points, and built-in amphibiousness. The Meteorite Guardsman is really strong. So even though, if you compare this guy to a Myrmidon, you're just going to feel sorry for yourself. They'll eat Myrmidons alive, even with the formation fighting aspect. And the built-in dark vision means fighting in deep oceans or caves, etc. They'll eat you alive. The other problem is that you're also now facing middle-age Pelagia if someone's picked them. Now, MA Pelagia is EA Pelagia with significant upgrades. And amongst those significant upgrades is one of the most blendery, killy, underwater sacred units in any era. The Knight of the Deep, yes, he's gold expensive, but if you compare this thing to an Aphroy, he's going to wreck your shit. The Lance Charge is solid. The Brant Spear is good. The Alicorn is an extra attack for attack density. The skills are strong. MR is high. Morale is high. 16 hit points. And, of course, Sacred. So it's going to carry some sort of bless. With even a bit of a bless, Knights of the Deep are going to destroy your shit underwater if you're not ready for them. Plus the fact that Pelagia and Relay both have access to the same sort of level of water elemental summoning out the gate as you do. They have creatable water 2s. You have creatable water 2s. The problem is their water 2s are even cheaper than yours. It's a problem. You face stiffer competition. You face stiffer competition on the land, and you face a much enhanced threat profile in the water. Middle Age Atlantis is even better suited to underwater combat than EA Atlantis was. It's just a tougher deal, and it puts a greater emphasis on you figuring out if you can diplo any other underwater nations in the game, or you have to sacrifice your optimal build, your super scales build, which is where Oceania thrives, for something that gives you more punch in the early game to make up for that fact. But there is very little reason that a player who is picking up middle-aged Pelagia won't want to murder you straight out the gate. With early-age Pelagia, it was more ambiguous. It was genuinely more ambiguous who would win that fight and how easily. A well-played middle-aged Pelagia matched against a well-played MA Oceania is the underwater fight going to the Pelagians, if that fight happens early. And all of that is problematic. It's why I regard MA Oceania as probably a bit more difficult. Now, if you can manage that underwater dimension, however, you've got additional ability to go on land and fight on land, because suddenly your cavalry are just that much better, and you can do that much more in terms of stand-up fights. Having high levels of artificial protection, that is bronze plate, means that when you start getting mass prot and natural protection in there, you can get some really tough cavalry units. Like, you can get a really tanky front line using your nature magic. Throw mass regen on there. They have 22 hit points naturally. You can make some bloody tough front lines out of your cavalry. Mobile, killy, tough, and highly resistant. And of course, they recuperate. Super handy. But you have this problem of Relay, Atlantis, even Ys might be able to put up resistance, although I'd argue a well-played Oceania will defeat a well-played Ys in an underwater fight, unless Ys has a really optimized Morvark Bless and Oceania is faffing around with scales and not doing the best it can. So, those are the pros and the cons. Your underwater competition is much stronger, more dangerous, and has more motivation to murder you, but when you're fighting on land, your armies are now more capable than they were in the early era, and they plateau higher because having a high protection unit means you can make better use of natural and later on earth protection buffs. Make sense? Great. So now I'm going to go through a few commanders and units and tactics that we talked about in the early Age Oceania video. I'm just going to pad them out for a couple of minutes and talk about them in more detail because we've got the spare time in this video. And while I don't want to pad it out necessarily just for the sake of it, I figure we can expand in a way we couldn't in the EA Oceania vid. So first of all, the Sirens. A few things I want to add about Sirens in general in terms of their usefulness and how you get the most out of them. Now, the Sirens still not incredible, but like, hear me out. Also, I misspoke earlier when I said Pelagia gets the cheaper water elemental summoners. If you're using Sirens underwater, your Sirens are in fact cheaper water elemental summoners. You just have to summon water power first, and you can't communion, unlike the Pelagian ones. So, a few things to remember about Sirens. The first is, on land, their mobility jumps heaps. They become flyers and they get something stupid like 28 map move, which is enough to cover a whole lot of territory. What this means is if you are maneuvering underwater, you want to be getting your Sirens on land and then sort of dropping them back into the ocean, because it's often faster to go ashore and then fly several sea provinces away and duck in from the coast than it is to swim there in oceanic siren form. That's point one. They're really, really mobile. It also means that in small doses you could technically use them as raiders, doing like minor elemental summoning with the little cloud elementals, but that's pretty expensive for what it is. But the option's there. They're very mobile, they are stealthy, they can cover a lot of ground real quickly. It's a pretty expensive stealthy scout, but it's there if you need it. The other thing to remember is that they, as stealthy, high mobility units with air-water crosspath, they're pretty well suited to counter-thugging duty and to point buffing your own thugs or supercombatants. So because they can drop the level 1 air and water buffs, and because they're flyers they can leave the battlefield, they make pretty good fluffers. They're also stealthy, which means that they don't need to show themselves unless they need to. They can carry gem reloads, and they're generally a decent supporting arm. Against opposing thugs, every Siren on land can still cast Frozen Heart, and as we all know, unless they're cold resistant, Frozen Heart murders thugs. It murders anything, really, that isn't cold resistant, doesn't regenerate like 50 hit points a turn. And of course, that level 1A is there if you need it. If you can get a Thunderstorm up and you can get them up to A2, they can actually do some reasonable air evocation stuff, or even do the full-sized air elementals with the gem, but you're really only going to be doing that with hero support or in the late game where you've got a boosted central mage. Point is, the Sirens aren't completely useless, and you'll have so many of them that it probably feels good to know that they have combat usages besides just being a researcher. The next thing to talk about is thugging and raiding as Oceania. Now, there's two ways to do your raiding. You can do it using stealthy thugs, or you can do it using your stealthy troops. the stealthy troops require significant numbers in order to mob PD, but they can do it. So while it's an expensive raiding party, it's also hard to catch as long as you're patient. The good old attack and then stealth immediately to avoid even ritual attacks argument applies here. There can be cases if you are, for example, going into a large battle and you want to cut some retreats unexpectedly. It's one way to do it. The more effective way to raid is probably to use thugged out Aphroy Hierophants. These guys, in the case of the nature ones, can of course do the nature buffs. They can also do Swarm, and Swarm is a perfectly reasonable way to kill PD as long as you got the nature gems to feed it. The water ones, they can quicken self if they've got a little bit of kit, sure, and they can counter thug with things like Frozen Heart as well. But being stealthy and sacred means that with a little bit of a bless, which you're likely to have even from an imprisoned, and a little bit of kit, Aphroy Hierophants can be raiding thugs, probably working in pairs most of the time, perfectly reasonably. You're a nation that has water, so you're going to have brands, you're going to have all sorts of decent kit. This gives you a raiding option that you shouldn't rule out. Capricorns are more for heavy thugging duty. They can do it. I tend to prefer using Capricorns as big casters to support armies. In my testing, that's more how I would use them, but they are competent heavy thugs. They're not super combatants by any stretch of the imagination. The hit points probably are not high enough, and their paths are not diverse enough. But with a little bit of fluffing, they can really make the enemy hurt. So, for example, if one of these gets appropriately point buffed before the fluffer retreats, and then it puts up foul vapors, and it's just built to survive in the enemy army until FV kills everything, that, for example, can work quite well. And because Capricorns are a recruit everywhere, and because you can transform them if you need to, you may even end up with some flying Capricorns, or things like that. They're expensive, but as Oceania, you have so little to spend your money on because you're that really, you're probably going to have a couple of Capricorns floating around that you can use for that sort of duty if you want to use them that way. There's no one's going to force you to use them that way. This leads to another note on transformations. People started talking about this in the comments, and I imagine they're probably going to do so over the next few days before I post this. So I'm just going to guess what people are saying here. There's a trade-off when it comes to transforming Capricorns. On one hand, it's an expensive use of nature gems on one hand that you can use to grow forts, that you can use for summons, for battlefield casting, for globals. Nature gems are like crack to you. You want all of them that you can get. So spending them on your Capricorns is risky. It's also risky in the sense that you might feeble-mind them or you might get a terrible chassis. However, you're guaranteed to get unless you feeble-mind, to remove the path negatives that you get from the landform C form of the Capricorn, which is good. It means that whichever area you're in, you're always going to have one path better than you would otherwise. If you're running luck and magic, which I do for Oceania, the chance of some good results is pretty high, and you do save on the upkeep. All in all, I fall into you don't need to transform all of your Capricorns, but there is an argument to transform Capricorn's school of thought. You might lose the arm slots and things like that, which removes some boosters. I wouldn't be fanatical about it, but the option is definitely there, and there's an economic case to be made for it, as well as a strategic case in terms of getting some pretty cool chassis. Plus, it's also fun to roll the dice sometimes. But if you're in a super competitive game, it's tight, maybe you don't want to make that gamble. Make sense? Cool. The next thing to talk about is what you need out of your god. Because now that the roster has pushed you into production, your options to go anything other than scales has diminished even further than it did earlier. You still need research in order to be vaguely competitive, because your Sirens are your coastal recruits, and they need magic to be efficient researchers. So you still want magic, you still want growth, because everyone wants growth. You now want production, and you're going to be transforming, so you probably want luck, which at this point you can dump your temperature, that's about it. So you're penned into scales. The question then becomes, what do you do with the god in the scales? And the one thing I will say is, the availability of the Cataphract and the lesser importance of the Afroi means there's even more opportunity in this age to build a pretender more around the access it gives you and less around the bless. So things like death bless points aren't particularly great. In terms of the value you get out of a bless from death, for a nation like Oceania, like a couple of points of undying are not the most valuable thing you could get with the bless. But having access to late game death summons, being able to just pop out some Wraith Lords or Mound Fiends or Liches at turn 36, it's hard to underestimate. Having some big late game global access or access to elemental royalty or something that's going to break you out into other fields, like that is real value, and you don't need to worry as much about making the Afroi competitive, because I'm not sure you can make them super competitive cheaply anyway. If anything, I'd still probably consider getting some poison resistance into the bless, or thinking a little bit about what is going to help make the Hierophants useful at mini-thugging, while also giving my nation late game diversity and access. I still don't think blood is the way to go, because you can't blood hunt underwater and you're not going to be able to scale it. But think about death, think about fire, think about astral, think about nature. I think those are all worth considering. And if you do astral, maybe there's an argument for Earth Astral Cross, because of course crystal gear is useful no matter who you are. But certainly I would make the case to consider access over bless efficacy in this age. The problem is you may face middle-aged Pelagia or another underwater combatant, in which case my argument remains try and solve it before the game, because the tax you're going to pay to get your pretender either blessing your Afroi enough to win that fight against things like Knights of the Deep, good luck, or in getting an awake that helps you stand up to people is so high that if you can avoid paying it almost any way, it's worth doing so. So get that hug box formed. Don't be a pushover, but get that hug box formed and enable yourself to scale out of control. When you're playing Oceania, it's worthwhile remembering that your nation historically is doomed to fail. The Dominions universe is a cruel one, and historically Oceania doesn't make it into the late age as a consolidated nation. Relay sweeps the oceans clear of all life. But you've got bronze, you've got good troops, strong magic, and you have all of the oceans and their living, their plants and their animals, the very value of nature itself to fight for. So you've got a lot on your side in terms of motivational factors. I would recommend you picking up this nation and trying to make it work. I think it's still like EA Oceania. It's average. It's possibly even better than average now, arguably, in some respects, because it's better than the previous Oceania, although probably not enough to kick it up an entire category. Its problem is that it's now facing harder opponents than EA Oceania faced. So if you're going into a game, check the other nations that are being played. If they are other water nations, then talk to them. And if they're giving off strong "we will murder you" vibes, then either reconsider playing EA Oceania or consign yourself to the fact that you're going to need to be superior in terms of skill. You've still got tools to fight underwater. You can pump out a lot of underwater cavalry, like a lot of it. You've got armored underwater cavalry. You've got W2s that can be water elemental summoners. You have Haliades who can force your research up early, but you don't have the same tools the other underwater powers do. And that's just the reality of the situation. Still, Satyrs, Capricorns, late game magic, stealth, mini thugs, there's a lot here that's worth working with. So by all means, give it a shot. Hope you enjoyed the shorter guide. Hope you didn't mind the continued potato quality. I'll work on it, and I'll be back with something again soon. Cheers.